Welcome to Amazing Cultivation Simulator. I powered through the learning curve because this game has something I've never seen before, and it's worth talking about. So let's talk about it. All of this kind of game, Dwarf Fortress and RimWorld, they're all about trying to tell the story of your base and all of the people within your base. It's an amalgam of everybody's stories, all twisted together into a final form that is more compelling than the individual parts. There are two pieces to that puzzle that are used by basically every base building game that wants to, and there's one new piece that I've never seen before, and it's only used here. So let's talk about it. The first piece is who gets to tell how much story. You see, some people actually work for a living. If your chef decides they have to go and rescue their mother from the mountaintops of Mount Doom and spend 6 weeks doing that, your base will fall apart. Everybody will starve. Same thing with your builder. If your builder gets taken out of the equation, you're not going to manage to finish your base before winter, and everybody will freeze. These people that actually do the work can't have very significant stories because they'll have to stop doing work and do their story instead. That's why their stories tend to be things like, oh, they fell in love and got married. And you're like, hey, good. They're both farmers, and that's as far as their story goes. Or, oh, they got sick. Well, let's patch them up and get them back out on the farm as fast as possible. It's not really a compelling arc. It's not a dramatic thing that you are going to make a movie about. It's just something that happens. That's why all of these games also have a second tier of character, a noble. Nobles are just loads. They don't do any work. They just get fed and clothed and nice rooms and all of that jazz. And in exchange, you don't care if they have to leave for 6 weeks to go and find their mom. Oh no, a noble left. What else am I going to do? Maybe I'll get some work done for once. That's the nature of the story, and that's how it always works out in these games, including this one. Because it's a very easy way to set things up so that the stories don't actually screw up your base. I'm not super happy about that because I feel that people who are workaday characters, out in the fields or whatever, should be allowed to have stories that are compelling and interesting and should be allowed to live their life. But the structure of the game makes it easy to do it like this, and that's the reason everybody does it like this. The next part of the puzzle is how do you actually create these stories? And the way that normally we do it is we do it through simple simple emergence. So the characters have traits that cause them to have stories. For example, this character, this is Ling Lao Han. She is our farmer. You can tell she's our farmer because she has a decent farming stat and it's got stars next to it. So obviously I assigned her to be a farmer. That began her personal story. We know who she is, we know where she's going to be, who she's going to be working with, what she's going to be doing. She's going to be out in the sun and the rain. She's going to be feeding our people and growing herbs. We know her personal story from that perspective because we see her stat and we know that we have used her like that. We know that we will if she hasn't been assigned, and if she has been assigned, we know that we have been. So just by looking at that stat, we immediately know her story, unless we've done something very strange on purpose. And that's what an emergent story is. It's about setting things up so that it creates a narrative. And in this case, the core beat of her narrative is that she's a farmer. At least, that's from the perspective of the base. The base loves that she's a farmer because now we've got more food and, more herbs. But personally, who is she? Personally, what is her story? The base doesn't really care about that. Now, you can use stats to try and determine social relationships and stuff. I find that it's not very memorable. It's hard to really get a feeling like people actually exist out of that. And that's why normally you use personal characteristics that do not have direct stat equivalents. Now, these do have stats attached to them because they change her stats when she's built as a character. But from the perspective of the player, these are things that make her who she is and determine what her social life is like. Look, someone has a crush on her. So she's a farmer and someone's got a crush on her. That's already going to be more compelling than just one or the other. But she's also a well-traveled evil sect lackey. And that's just immediately like, okay, yeah, we know what she's been up to, and we have a lot of ideas as to what she might get up to in the future because we see these traits. Now, of course, the game doesn't actually use them like that. The game has very little interest in actually using these traits effectively, and that's true across the board. It's not just in this game. But these traits are still an indelible mark in our minds of the personal stories of these characters. If they were used correctly, we might be thinking, oh, maybe she'll tell us that she has friends back in the evil sect that we need to go rescue, or maybe she's actually a double agent. Maybe evil sect lackey will, evolve to something new, depending on how we treat it. Like, oh, we have to convince her to not be an evil sect lackey anymore, and to do that, maybe we'll get her married to Kuo Hung here, and that's going to be, a fun story. It's an emergent possibility. And this is a big part of the importance of these stories. When we say that something has an emergent story, we do not mean that a story happens. We do not mean that dice roll and where they land, you get a story. We mean that the stories arise naturally out of the conditions of the game. And a big part of that is what we choose to do. The player. What the player chooses to set up. And that's the third piece, because I've never really seen the player given a strong option to create an emergent story. It's always very soft and wobbly options that don't usually work out. But here, there is a way to flat out tell someone what their emergent story is going to be. And that's what you do with your martial artists. See, when someone becomes a magical martial arts master, you have to choose what kind of magical martial arts master they're going to be. Yu Chariot, and Chariot is not her name, it's just a tag I gave her because I couldn't remember which of the characters was which. Yu Chariot practices a martial art called Grand Chariot Wisdom Law. Grand Chariot Wisdom Law has a very specific progression. You break through it in very specific methods. It's a very straightforward way to ascend, but it has very specific sets of skills at each of these levels that do very different things. So there are a couple of paths available to her as a martial artist. And of course, she can also read some unorthodox manuals to tweak that even further. By setting her up as a Grand Chariot Wisdom Law practitioner, we have set her life along a specific path because we know that she's probably going to go for some of these down here. Maybe she'll try and go for the Eureka pill at the very end. These things are not set in stone, but they are very, very strongly, penciled in. This is a way for us to keep track of what these characters will become. Even if we forget all about this character, or if a new practitioner just joins up out of the blue, we can just glance at what martial art style they're using and immediately know what their future will hold. And then, of course, we can use that to put them in the right places at the right times. We can use that to make our base flourish along with them. It's pretty straightforward, right? For example, one of the methods that you might use is Reincarnator. Here it is, 6 Paths Reincarnation. This character would be crap at it, but that's why she didn't choose it. This has really, really strong ups and downs as you progress through it. And because of that, you have to understand when the character is going to be weak and when the character is going to be strong and plan your base around that. It's quite compelling. This method also is not shallow. It's not something like, oh, all Grand Chariot Wisdom practitioners are going to do this and this in the future. It's not really like that because the rest of the character matters. For example, the Grand Chariot Wisdom Law is a martial art that is a martial arts martial art. It trains you how to be really, really good at kicking ass and not much else. Here's the problem. She's actually pretty shit at kicking ass. Her personality is not well suited for it. She's actually a spellcaster, which is a shame because there are no spells in this particular martial art. But she had no stats in any of the others. So it was either have good progression in a martial art that doesn't suit her personality, or have very, very poor progression in a martial art that does. Here you can see the stats that determine which martial art you would be good at. This is similar all across the line. For example, here is the main character, the first person on the list that I went into the base with. She is a blind martial artist. I did that because it sounded like it would be interesting. She practices an ultra-rare martial art, a high-tier martial art called the emotion severing law. And you can see that exactly when she ranks up is a bit different from her cohorts. Everyone is a little bit different. This is more different than even that, because if Yu Chariot wants to rank up, she just sits in her room and goes through a rank up procedure. But if Kui Blind wants to rank up, she has to leave. She has to go on an adventure every single time she wants to rank up. But she's blind. And even as a martial artist, that is a serious problem if you're trying to wander the world. It's a really fun, compelling story, and it's made even better because if she reaches Golden Core, which is the next rank up, she can learn the Reconstruction Manual, which will allow her to get her eyes back. Isn't that a compelling emergent story? It isn't that the dice were rolled and she ended up like this. It's that all of these systems work in specific ways, and I set up a future. It's not a future written in stone. She's got to struggle to achieve it. But I can see that future. I can work towards that future. I can build it together with the rest of my base and the other people in my facility. It is a compelling way to tell the story of the facility itself and her at the same time. This is a really marvelous idea. The idea that you can have these futures, just pencil them in, and they're pretty solid. You can't just switch futures later. It's quite a challenge to swerve too far off the path, but they could die. So this approach allows you to have all sorts of emergent stories planned out, works everything together really, really easily. It works well with the personal characteristics of the character. And just in general, I find that it is a very interesting way to do things. It's also a very natural way to tell the game that you want these characters to have really compelling adventures. If they have to leave for 6 weeks, then that's fine. You accept that. Similarly, you don't have to give them fancy schmancy rooms. But you do want to give them fancy schmancy rooms because their martial arts progresses faster when they have fancy schmancy rooms. And you might be thinking these rooms don't look very fancy schmancy. Yeah, they're not. But what they have is a whole bunch of spirit stuff. Over here we've got wooden rooms filled with wood. Over here we've got stone rooms filled with stone. And that really helps these characters advance very, very rapidly. And in short order, we'll probably build ourselves a little kiosk to help them advance even faster. Not because there is some arbitrary demand that they have a throne and 2 harps or whatever, but because we have built their future and we know what that future is, and we would like to reach it at a reasonable speed. That's why this game is compelling. Just watch that on-ramp, huh? Yeah, it's a rough learning curve, I'll tell you. Have a good one.